For centuries, pharaonic Egypt, known to its ancient inhabitants as Kemet, has intrigued the global imagination. But beneath the allure of gold-covered sarcophagi and towering obelisks lies a more complicated story of how Egyptology, the very field dedicated to studying this civilization, emerged under the shadow of European colonialism and racial biases.
Il est certain que les savants d'il y a 150 ans, les contemporains de la naissance de l'égyptologie moderne, savaient parfaitement que l'Égypte était une civilisation nègre et négro-africaine. Il ne manquait pas de science, absolument pas. Mais ils ont falsifié sciemment l'histoire.
In this expanded exploration, we will delve into the dirty hidden secrets of Egyptology, scrutinize the systematic distortion of Kemet's African origins, and highlight insights from notable African scholars who have long championed the truth about one of the world's greatest civilizations. It is well documented that the modern European fascination with ancient Egypt received a colossal boost in 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the territory. Accompanying his military expedition was a cohort of savants, artists, cartographers, naturalists, linguists, and others, who collectively produced the monumental Description de l'Égypte. This multi-volume work was groundbreaking. For the first time, vast amounts of information about Kemet were catalogued, illustrated, and disseminated in Europe. Yet, as historians such as Edward Said in Orientalism and Martin Bernal in Black Athena argue, the context of European colonial expansion shaped the collection, interpretation, and presentation of this knowledge. The motivations were not merely scholarly curiosity. Behind the drive to investigate Kemet's wonders lay the desire to bolster a sense of European racial and cultural superiority. As a result, much of the early European scholarship on ancient Egypt was filtered through a colonial lens, systematically ignoring or downplaying the civilization's undeniable African roots.
Were the ancient Egyptians black?
Yes, I mean, every indication that we have, historical information, linguistic, art, in terms of art, in terms of science, the ancient Egyptians were African people. And anyone, as John Henry Clark, the eminent historian, likes to say, who was in Africa, who was not black, was either an invader or the son or the daughter of an invader. Africans were black, and in antiquity, of course, the ancient Egyptians were black people.
Mm-hmm. Well, what categories of evidence do you have to support your contention that the ancient Egyptians were
black?
Well,
it's a curious question that you ask about the categories of support, and the reason it's a curious question is because no one asks. If you talked about the Greeks, no one will say to you, what proof do you have that the ancient Greeks were white people? Nobody asks that kind of question. They ask that question about Egypt, but the categories are numerous categories. But
the ancient people themselves referred to their land as Kemet, which translates roughly as the Black Land. Many scholars, including Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, the African origin of civilization, myth, or reality, interpret this as a nod to the land's dark, fertile soil and its black African populace. Historian Don Griffin poignantly notes how easily we absorb biases when we passively accept information. Egyptology's early gatekeepers, driven by colonial imperatives, promulgated oversimplified or blatantly incorrect notions, casting Kemet as a civilization divorced from Africa. Through influential museums, university curricula, and popular media, these biases have been perpetuated, so much so that they have come to be seen by many as unquestionable truths. One of the most influential voices on this topic is African-American sociologist, historian, and writer Chancellor Williams. In his seminal work, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Williams outlines 7 hidden principles that, in his view, have guided how institutions of Egyptology, and by extension mainstream academia, shape and deliver information, ignore or refuse to publish. Any facts of African history that undermine the theory of European racial superiority are often dismissed. For instance, evidence such as melanin dosage tests, linguistic parallels, and historical eyewitness accounts like Herodotus, who described the ancient Egyptians as having black skin and woolly hair, are rarely emphasized in mainstream Egyptological discourse, create religious and scientific doctrines. This principle normalizes the oppression and enslavement of African peoples under the guise of civilizing missions or scientific racism. Early European anthropologists measured skulls and invoked pseudosciences to argue for racial hierarchies that placed Africans at the bottom. Flood the world with Eurocentric African histories. Histories of Africa have often been authored from a European vantage point, presenting the African continent as lacking agency or intellectual achievements. George G. M. James, in Stolen Legacy, discusses how the philosophical and intellectual legacy of Kemet was appropriated by the ancient Greeks, yet taught in Western academia as purely European in origin. Rename people and places. Renaming African locations and historical figures with Arabic or European nomenclature obscures their African identity. This is seen in naming conventions such as Egypt, from the Greek Egyptos, instead of Kemet, and ignoring the African names of the pharaohs in favor of Hellenized or Romanized forms. Change the criteria for defining race. The one-drop rule in the Americas made anyone with any African ancestry black, whereas in ancient contexts, the standard is reversed, downplaying or denying African heritage to maintain a narrative of non-black origin for significant historical figures. Attribute black achievements to outside influence. When black participation in major civilizational contributions cannot be denied, Eurocentric scholarship often claims it must have been introduced by external, i.e., non-black peoples. Ivan van Sertima, in They Came Before Columbus, illustrates how similar tactics are used to negate African influences in other parts of the world.
Hydrogen bombs in Africa, so that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa. The African, therefore, the image of the African ancestor has been built up upon the lowest common denominator. When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst.
Discredit ancient historians. When ancient historians, Greek, Roman or otherwise, contradict modern Eurocentric narratives, clearly describing Egyptians as black or referencing African presence, these accounts are dismissed as inaccurate or overly romanticized.
Now, Martin Bernal's feeling is poor old Africans, they must have a place in the sun, they must have a share in this story. That it's so important to have a high culture of the European model, that somehow the blacks must be fitted into it. And though that's very well-meaning, in the end it can't help being patronizing, and really it's extraordinarily Europocentric, because the great thing for the blacks is to give them a part in the European story.
These tactics, Williams argued, were intended to protect illusions of racial superiority and prevent colonized and enslaved peoples from recognizing their true historical worth. This viewpoint aligns with Dr. Joseph Ben Johannan's arguments in Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, wherein he stresses that the rewriting of African history has profound psychological and socio-political consequences.
People of Central Africa migrated north up along this river. Yes, I'm saying that the original high culture, where the people first start to make scratches, symbols, writing down, heraldic and so forth, finally develop into alphabetical presentations, mathematical signs, religious signs and symbols and so forth. They actually had their beginning in Central East Africa. What it has here, what it is saying to the world, it relieves people from a religious bondage, religious slavery. If people knew what was here, they could see all the lies being told to them. They will see the reality and truth about religion. They see the love that the ancients did when they started this. They will see that, for instance, the Virgin Mary concept of Immaculate Conception is nothing new. And they were dealing with a human condition. And the whole thing based upon a God, especially a Unitarian God. one God came from here, not from Rome, not from England, London, not from Greece, Athens. It came from here. Whether you're Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or what, you got the basis of what your religion is here, along the Nile. The whole world must look to Egypt. The entire world, bar not a single country, every high culture must come here for the beginning of what they are. I don't care if it's Jewish, if you're Christian, or you're Muslim, if you're Greek, or you're Roman, you must come here. If you're talking about Abraham, you're talking about Moses, they were here. Moses, they said, was born here in a place called Goshen. Abraham came here and received his education. He had no education before he came here. All of them came here. The whole thing about the 10 Commandments came out of the 42 negative confessions.
Dr. Ben is teaching reverse racism.
They call it what they want. I don't mind what they call it. The fact is, if a teacher come here and prove me wrong, I'll go any way they got and show them what they wrote, where it came from, and carry them to where it comes for them to see it. The point is, my evidence still exists. They can't show me Adam and Eve, but I could show them Osiris.
Skeptics of Williams's 7 principles claim that they are merely speculative, and that no such secret meetings ever occurred. However, historical parallels, such as the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers divided the African continent among themselves without African representation, suggest that clandestine or exclusive assemblies have indeed determined the fate and narrative of entire regions. In the realm of academia, it would not be unprecedented for a small circle of influential scholars to guide or control the prevailing narrative. Understanding that Kemet was fundamentally an African civilization challenges the myth of African barbarism and backwardness, often perpetuated in traditional Western histories. It underscores Africa's central role in laying foundations of science, mathematics, astronomy, art, and spirituality. Recognizing the African lineage of Kemet fosters a stronger connection among African people, both on the continent and in the diaspora, to a legacy of resilience and innovation. As Anthony T. Browder shows in Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization, the cultural and intellectual links between Kemet and other parts of Africa are numerous and undeniable. For many Afrocentric scholars and individuals, seeing themselves in the pharaonic record can be profoundly affirming. This reframes the narrative of African diaspora communities from one primarily focused on enslavement and colonization to a broader, empowering heritage that stretches back millennia. By challenging the entrenched biases of traditional Egyptology, we pave the way for more accurate and inclusive scholarship. Figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, in works like The World in Africa, have consistently called for truthful, research-based reconstructions of African history. Accepting the truth about Kemet's African origins does not diminish the global significance of ancient Egypt's achievements. It enhances it, showing that Africa, as the birthplace of humanity, was also the birthplace of many of civilization's most enduring contributions. The field of Egyptology, while illuminating in many respects, still grapples with the vestiges of its Eurocentric and colonial heritage. The biases established in the late 18th and 19th centuries remain deeply entrenched, influencing how we learn, teach, and talk about one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. Scholars like Chancellor Williams, Cheikh Anta Diop, George G.M. James, John Henrik Clarke, and many others have long argued for a more equitable, fact-based representation of Kemet's past, one that recognizes its true identity as an African civilization. The power of this recognition cannot be overstated. It challenges centuries of misconceptions, fosters a renewed sense of pride among people of African descent, and promotes a more truthful, inclusive approach to global history. As we continue to uncover and interpret the wonders of ancient Egypt, we must do so with a critical eye and a commitment to truth, no matter how much it disrupts the status quo. By doing so, we not only pay homage to the ancient peoples who built Kemet, but also usher in a new era of Afrocentric scholarship that reclaims Africa's place at the heart of civilization's story.
Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.